What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Young Guns podcast. Obviously, you, the fans, have been following the news about Jeremy Swayman. There's a lot to talk about on his front. Is he going to stay in Boston? Boston? Is he on the move? Cam Neely had some comments the other day. So let me just ask you, Luca, what are your initial thoughts on the situation and where we are now?
I think it's turned into a little bit of a shit show, to be honest. I mean, I don't know if you guys well, obviously, if you're paying attention to the news, you know that Cam Neely did a press conference the other day talking a little bit about the Boston Bruins, and he was brought up the question of Jeremy Swayman's contract situation. And well, let's just say that he said stuff that was a little bit out of
It was
not
out of
context,
pocket.
but out of the ordinary in the sense out of pocket in the sense where he goes, in CBS News as they're reporting that Cam Neely says Jeremy Swayman has 64 million reasons to be playing goalies to be playing. Goalie's agent then responded, and this is what Louis Gross, who represents Jeremy Swayman, had to say in regards to that. He basically says, normally I do not release statements or discussions, negotiations through the media. However, in this case, I feel I need to defend my client as today's press conference, $60 million was referenced. This was the first time that number was discussed in our negotiations prior to the press conference, and no offer was made reaching that level. We are extremely disappointed, and this was not fair to Jeremy. We will take a few days to discuss where we go from here. And what was interesting about that is a couple of hours later, there was rumored that he was then offered a little bit less than $64 million. He was actually offered 8 times 7.8,
Yeah.
which is exactly the amount of money that Boston has left on their cap space. So Boston pretty much gave Swayman essentially all they had, right? Or rumored was that they were going to give Jeremy Swayman, I think it was 8 years at $7.8 million, which is what I referenced, which I think comes down to like 62 million or 63 million. So near the $64 million mark, but not exactly. And the rumor is that Swayman is looking more in the realm of, between $64 million, which would be 8 times 8, or but around 8 years, 8.5 million.
Yeah, eight and
So
a half.
right. So it's a little bit of a weird situation. I mean, I personally think Jeremy Swayman is a goalie that you can pay $8 million for, right? The question I think that's more concerning is, you know, you have Cam Neely, who, you know, is part of the Boston Bruins organization. I believe he's the president of hockey ops, or he's within the organization in some capacity that's pretty big. And you have a guy who's well respected within the Bruins organization, and he comes out and basically bashes your starting goaltender. But the thing that doesn't make any sense is because at the beginning of the offseason, the goal was to re-sign Jeremy Swayman, and that's the reason they traded Linus Ullmark, is because they weren't going
Yeah,
to be able to keep both of them, and they knew that Jeremy Swayman was going to command a lot of money and was going to want a hefty pay increase. And so in order for them to do that, they would have to trade Linus Ullmark in order to do it.
of
And so
course
they
they
did.
couldn't
They traded
afford
Linus
both.
Ullmark. Right. And so they trade Linus Ullmark. They acquire, a couple of assets, a first round pick. They acquired Eunice Corpusalo, who was like, okay, Corpusalo is going to be their backup. And then nothing else happened. Like nothing else happened in the sense where they didn't progress in negotiations with Swayman. And now
Yeah.
we're at a point where he has no contract going into training camp. We're a week away from the season, less than a week away actually from the season. And your starting goaltender right now is Eunice Corpusalo, right?
Yeah, and they just signed the
So
guy off of waivers. And I think
yeah,
um, here's what I think. Here's what I think about, you're talking about eight and a half AV, and you're talking about Boston's legitimate offer, which is reported at 7.8.
right.
There's not that's less than $1 million in a discrepancy here. I
Right.
think if this is the bigger problem, the Bruins mismanaged this whole situation from
Agreed.
start to finish in the offseason. They traded Linus Ullmark to the Sens without having certainty with Jeremy Swayman, and then comes July 1st, and they go on a spending spree, sign Elias Lindholm to his deal with a almost $8 million AAV. You sign also Nikita Zadorov to a long-term contract, but you're starting netminder, one of the cornerstone pieces of this team who is so important for them in the playoffs, especially last year, is kind of left, out in the open. And the fact that it's just a couple million, not even $500,000, that's the discrepancy here, just goes to show it's the Bruins mismanaged the cap. They mismanaged personnel decisions, and now they're at the point where they are. We're approaching the regular season, and Jonas Korpisalo is going to be their starter. They signed Yuri Patera off of waivers, and then you have president of the team, Cam Neely, who comes out and is sounding petty. And honestly, quite frankly, I think he sounds like a jackass with what he's saying.
For real, agreed.
Because you're saying, you're basically taking a job at the player that could tarnish his reputation with the fans. Also, you're using it as a way to negotiate through the media, and you're blowing this situation out of proportion. And it's not, negotiations probably become more hostile than they were before the statement was made, right? So
right.
I don't think it's a good situation managed by the Bruins. And now where do we go from here? I don't know if they're real trade partners at the moment, because every team is trying to get cap compliant before the start of the regular season. But there are some teams that have cap space, but it's just, are they willing to make a move like this because big assets involved? Are they willing to make it right before the start of the regular season? This would have been a better question for the month of July. So what are your thoughts? You think he gets traded, or do you think Swayman is going to eventually sign in Boston, and this whole situation is going to be put behind us?
I think he ends up staying in Boston. I mean, the thing with this situation is, it's very hard for a trade of this caliber to happen mid-season, like you said, with all the salary cap issues that are going on, especially around the league. And the other thing is that you're the Boston Bruins, and you look at their roster, right? And we were kind of talking about this a little bit outside the podcast, but you signed Nikita Zadorov, you have Charlie McAvoy, Hampus Lindholm, who are still on pretty hefty deals. You have David Pastrnak, who's at $11 million. You have Elias Lindholm's at 7.7. You have Marchand, who's got another year left on. Well, he's got this year, and then he's a UFA. Like, Boston is not in a position to start rebuilding, and they don't have young prospects that they're able to build around to start the year. You know what I mean? So the issue with Boston is you cannot trade Jeremy Swayman and not essentially replace him. And if you're going to trade Jeremy Swayman, you're basically saying to yourself, we're accepting the fact that we're going to go into a rebuild, which I don't think any of your core guys are going to want. My thing
I don't see it that way. The way I see it is that Swayman is going to get traded. They're going to try to get equal value in terms of a player who could come in and contribute right now. That's what they're looking for. Boston is not going to be in a situation where they're left empty-handed and they don't have basically a guy who's going to help them win now and getting in this trade. They're not going to accept prospects. I think they're going to try to get a guy that's a legitimate player. And if it's another goaltender that's a part of this deal, maybe. I think it's unlikely. It's a goalie. It ends up being a goalie for goalie. They probably get a good forward out of this, and then after they solve their through either the waiver wire, another trade, or internally they'll try to figure out their goalie situation. But look, now we'll get into the part where we name out our teams, because Luca and I have come up both with two teams each who we think are good trade partners for the Bruins. And at this point, we're looking at their cap space and all, and just in terms of the overall fit for a player, we think they'll be good destination. So I'll start with one. You'll give one, and then we'll keep going. So for me it'll be the Anaheim Ducks. Look, Anaheim, it's got the cap space. I'm not sure if they're entirely secure with their goalie situation with Dostal, and I think they have a lot of assets, right? Anaheim is a team that is loaded with young prospects, good young NHLers as well. And you get one of their, young 23, 24-year-old forwards who's already, a familiar name in this league and could contribute. And Bruins getting something like that in return. I'll throw Trevor Zegras' name out there just because he's been in trade rumors.
That's what I was going to ask you is, would you trade, if you're the Ducks, do you trade Trevor Zegras to try to get a Jeremy Swayman? That actually makes a lot of sense, because
I think I think you have a lot of options at center. I think we haven't seen the best of Trevor Zegras yet. But Jeremy Swayman is really good, and I think this is that would be the perfect scenario for Anaheim to legitimately get better right now, because yes, they're a team that is kind of at the fringe of rebuild and
Right.
trying to be a bubble team. But I think Anaheim, there's an organizational pressure now to start winning more games. Maybe not make the playoffs this year, but winning more games. I
Right.
think you bring a guy like Swayman, stabilize the net, um, add some sort of comfort, a cushion in front of your young players, and I think it'll just be beneficial for them. I think he could make this team better and instill a lot of confidence in the group. So Anaheim is my first team.
Yeah, I actually think that that's a really not a bad not a bad shot at all. I think it makes a lot of sense for the Ducks to do that. My team that I think makes a lot of sense is the Chicago Blackhawks, and I'm going to tell you why. You know,
Interesting.
this is a team that this season added a lot of pieces to their lineup, right? They got better. They added Bertuzzi, they added Teravainen. They added guys like TJ Brody as well on defense. They really bolstered their team. They made a couple of really nice draft picks as well. In Artem Levshinov on defense, obviously Frank Nazar, who's a really promising prospect. He's going to be playing in the AHL this year along with Kevin Korchinski. And they have a lot of young talent coming up as well. But what's interesting about Chicago is, obviously you have Connor Bedard, who's the biggest thing, but I don't think Chicago is as far off as maybe people think. And I'm not saying that the goaltending is a problem. I think Peter Mrazek did a really good job last year with Chicago, all things considered, considering how bad the team was on paper. I think you add a guy like Jeremy Swayman, who's 25 years old, to a team like Chicago, with a star talent like Connor Bedard and with all the pieces that they have in their lineup and the young players that they have, a Philip Kurashev and stuff like that as well. I think it makes a lot of sense. And the other thing too is with Chicago is they're at a point where they're still in a rebuild, but they're trying to get better, right? So you add a goaltender in Jeremy Swayman. Let's say you give him an 8-year deal with Swayman. That'll make him go until he's 33. By the time you're ready to be competitive, Jeremy Swayman's probably in the prime of his career. So you're going to get Jeremy Swayman at the best time of his career, potentially, right? At his prime. And so I think it's a lot more of a situation of like, if Chicago's willing to make it work and they're willing to move up with some assets, I do think there's a trade partner there with the Chicago Blackhawks. And the other thing too is if Boston really wants, I mean, listen, Peter Mrazek is not a bad goaltender and has played very, very well in Chicago. I know he's turned his career around after what happened in Toronto. I think that it makes a lot of sense, even if you need a tandem of like Korpisalo and Mrazek to split starts. I don't think it's as bad as as it looks. And I think what it does is also allows Boston to get some other assets as well from the Chicago Blackhawks that can help them in other areas. So I do think Chicago makes a lot of sense, and I do think that there could be a goalie swap there that makes a little bit more sense for the Bruins. And at the same time, you would only have to pay Mrazek $3 million. So your goaltending tandem would be about $6 million total, which would be more than anything you would, or less than anything you would pay Jeremy Swayman. So that's how I see it. But I think it makes a lot of sense for him to go to Chicago.
Interesting. And I think, with your Chicago take, let's say it's a trade involving I don't think it'll be goalie for goalie, but let's say
right.
It's Mrazek for Swayman and there's other pieces involved, but those are the two main players out of it. So
Yeah.
Boston would be, they would still have about $3.5 million of cap space to spare.
Right.
You could still do something with that. There's still going to be teams that are going to be willing to there are teams that are going to be willing to deal, and maybe you add another depth option there. Chicago doesn't really have, I don't think, what Boston's looking for in terms of either forward or defenseman.
Right.
And I think Boston's decor is pretty much set in stone. So yeah, I think Chicago is a team that I think would benefit from having a guy like Swayman. I think it could help them take the next step. And for my number 2 team, the Colorado Avalanche.
Interesting.
Look, they're not scared to make big moves. They made big moves at the trade deadline. Bowen Byram, Middlestap. They got, I believe, Sean Walker via trade last year as well. They were wheeling and dealing. I think this is a team that's not satisfied. They didn't really have the best playoff run last year, and I think their core is at that level that, surround them a little bit more, and then they'll take you to that special place again.
Yeah.
Georgiev just let me just say, Georgiev let them down last year. Georgiev was, if you look at expected goals against and compared to his peers, he was he was not, one of the best goalies in the NHL out of 96 reported goalies. Let's just say that. And about a day ago, they played in preseason in a game where he allowed 6 goals. And he
Yeah.
started the whole game, and he allowed 6 goals in preseason. And I think you get results like that. That's pretty worrisome. I just don't think Georgiev is the guy, and they could be a team that could have a massive that could benefit from a massive upgrade at goalie, and they also have legit. It's gonna have to be an even exchange for salary probably, because Colorado's got their cap constraints, but I think they could dish a legit asset back to the Bruins. It's just a question of who it is. So if you pull up Colorado's salary cap situation just to see how this kind of move will pan out logistically.
Yeah. So they have currently $2 million in cap space, and you're
Yeah.
saying Georgiev, or like you would
Not,
say
I
Georgiev goes
wouldn't.
back the other way, right?
Maybe Georgiev goes back the other way in this trade, but they've got other assets as well. Maybe, like I
You know
said,
what I
not a
would tell
defense.
you? You know what I would tell you for this? There's,
Tell
you
me.
look at a team, like one guy that could make sense is, like, for example, let's say, obviously Landeskog and Nichushkin kind of hurts them, but I'm saying, like, you throw a guy like Lehkonen, let's say, into this deal. Let's say you throw
I was just
Lehkonen
thinking that. Yeah.
and, like, I don't know, a draft pick and a couple and maybe a prospect or something like that could make a lot of sense for Colorado, like in terms of, because you have to it's money in money out type thing, right? Like you have to give up a roster player to get Jeremy Swayman, especially for Colorado's sake, because they don't have real cap space to do it. Yeah, they have Landeskog and Nichushkin on IR, but there's possibility that Landeskog comes back this year and Nichushkin comes back, right? So if both those guys come back, you're gonna need cap space for them. So I think like if you throw a Lehkonen and, like, let's say a Callum Ritchie, who's a young prospect that they have, or a Kovalenko, let's say, who's 24 years old and has some upside, like, and a first round pick or something like that could be enticing for the Bruins. Maybe they'll be like, look, give us Georgiev, and I don't think Colorado would hesitate to trade Georgiev if the opportunity presented itself. So I don't think it's a bad idea, to be honest.
Yeah, I think, there could even be a situation they keep Georgiev, and maybe it's a package like you're saying. And I think it would make sense with Arturi Lehkonen, just because I think the Bruins, they didn't bring back a guy, a type like JVR. They obviously lost Jake DeBrusk. I think they're a team that could use a middle, a secondary scoring winger, as
Right.
you say. Arturi Lehkonen could be the guy for them. Ross Colton, maybe not.
You know who
Jonathan
else?
Drouin, I don't really see that as a fit. Maybe a guy like Miles Wood, I would also maybe pitch.
Yeah.
Yeah, who are you thinking?
I know you said defense, Boston doesn't really need help, but I don't think you can ever have an abundance of defensemen. I think Sam Girard is a guy that could be interesting too. And the reason I say that is because he's been in trade talks before. And
Yeah,
it's a guy that is young enough that, he's still 26, so he's not in the prime of his career yet. He's going to be in the prime of his career probably in about 2 years. And, for Colorado, it's $5 million out of the books. But what it does is it allows a guy like Eric Brandstrom and even a guy like Oliver Shillington to, let's say, get more minutes. And for Colorado, they already have 8 defensemen. Like, they're not really in urgent need of, let's say, a Sam Girard. And what you're doing is you're essentially sacrificing Sam Girard. So you are sacrificing a little bit of team defense, but you're acquiring a goaltender who is miles better than Georgiev, right? So you're upgrading in a position of weakness for a position that is already a pretty big strength of yours to begin with in terms of defensemen. So I think Girard is also not a bad idea, just because he makes $5 million a year. He's still 26 years old. He's steady. And I think the Bruins, could have a guy that, could potentially be, let's say, a good top 4 defenseman for them.
yeah,
It
offensive
allows them
minded
to have a
guy
really good
makes
top
sense.
6.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
no, that's
that's
not
what
a
I would
bad
do.
that's not a bad shout at all. Well, with 8 defensemen right now, they're gonna um and 7 of them right now are on one-way contracts. They they definitely have some decisions to make. Colorado, but it's not a bad shout at all. Who's your second team?
My second team is one that I was gonna say the Montreal Canadiens. I'm gonna change
Oh
my
boy.
pick. I'm gonna change my pick and say the Philadelphia Flyers. And the reason I'm saying the Philadelphia Flyers is because if you look at their goaltending situation right now, they have Ivan Fedotov and Samuel Urson. Now, Urson last year showed at times that he can do it, right? Fedotov, look, 27 years old. He came from the KHL. We kind of don't really know what he is, right? But the thing about Philly is they have a very interesting situation because Ryan Ellis is on LTIR, right? So he probably won't play this year. So technically, they're going to have a little bit more cap space than usual. But the thing about Philly is last year, one of the criticisms was with their team is that they played some really good hockey, but they weren't able to get goaltending towards the end of the year because Urson let them down, Fedotov let them down, right? So what ended up happening is they ended up putting themselves in a real big disadvantage in terms of the goaltending situation. With Philly, they have a lot of guys that they can move, right? There was rumors this year about, Scott Lawton maybe being traded. There was rumors about guys like Morgan Frost potentially being traded, right? I think Philly's got some interesting pieces here that they can move. They obviously drafted some guys as well that they've, could look at as potential guys that they can potentially move. A guy like Oliver Bonk is an example of one. Jet Lachenko, who they drafted this year, maybe. But I think that Jeremy Swayman would make a lot of sense for Philly because it would put Philly in a position where they can now officially be competitive, right? Because they've got Matvei Michkov, who was their high-end prospect that everybody was excited about. They've got a good team on paper. Owen Tippett took a next step. Travis Konecny's still a really good player. Farabee's a really good player. And last year, they played really well. Like, they had a really good team. It just came down to, Urson. Obviously, the Carter Hart situation hurt them as well, and they had their future goaltender in Carter Hart, who's not there anymore, right, due to obviously legal reasons. So he's not there, and you're kind of relying on two goaltenders that are not really proven and haven't really shown much at the NHL level to be, let's say, confident in their abilities to be able to hold down the fort for Philly. So I think with Swayman, he gets them over the top, and I think Philly could find ways to make a move with that and be able to be creative with this in terms of being able to acquire a goaltender of Jeremy Swayman's caliber. Not to mention, like I said, with the LTIR play of Ryan Ellis, this cap space changes a little bit, right? Because Ellis isn't coming back. So you have $3 million. Let's say you add the 6.3.
Yeah, you got a $9 million. You could afford a Jeremy Swayman,
right?
And if he's asking,
you can even trade one of the goalies.
Yeah.
What's that?
And if that's what Jeremy Swayman, that's his asking price in terms of a contract, they could definitely afford it. And what I'll say also is that John Tortorella wasn't shy of talking about their goalie situation recently, and he said it scared it scared the shit out of him. So I mean that's pretty self-explanatory in myself in itself. So they could be a team that's looking to upgrade at the goalie position, or else it's going to be another. If they don't get that position right, especially with a team that's really trying to break through, I think it would be a long season in Philly if they don't get that addressed, the goalie situation somewhere.
And if you look at their draft pick values, I mean, look, in 2025, they have 3 first-rounders and 3 second-rounders. So they definitely have, like, I know Boston's probably not going to be looking for picks, but you do have a first-round pick that you can play around with and a second-round pick that you can play around with to throw into a deal. Right, so Philly definitely has assets that they can move to acquire Jeremy Swayman. You get what I mean? So, that's how I see it. I mean, I would have said Montreal. I think Montreal makes sense. The only problem with Montreal is
they're not trading with the Bruins.
They're not trading with the Bruins, and the other thing too is, they were interested in Askarov, and I think that's why Montreal is like not a big surprise that I think they would make a call to Boston. I don't know how far it would go, but I think they would make a call to Boston just because of the fact that they were interested in Askarov. But I also don't think Montreal's in an urgent rush for goaltending because they've also have guys like Jacob Dobesh and Jacob Fowler. And another team that I actually think could make a lot of sense is the other Pennsylvania team, the Pittsburgh Penguins. They've had a lot of problems with their goaltending. Obviously, Jarry hasn't been great, and neither has Nedeljkovic. I think Jeremy Swayman could be an interesting situation for the Penguins. The only problem is they don't really have the cap space to do it. So
or the
that would
assets
be
are willing to give away right now. That would be interesting, I think, for the Bruins.
right.
You
But
got
I
a lot
do
of
think that from a need standpoint, it makes sense. But
yeah, definitely. I don't think they're that comfortable with Tristan Jarry. I think they need a big season out of him. The Nemjelkovic was good last year. Hopefully he could either carry half the load or have another good
yeah.
season there as well.
No, I
But
definitely agree.
Pittsburgh as a team it's right now they're in a tough situation where they have aging players on expensive contracts who are still the core of this team, and they don't really have any young trade chips either. They obviously got Rutger McGroarty, who became their top prospect by default, but beyond that there's not much in their system. There's maybe two or three guys maybe. So that'd be a tough situation for them to manage. And are you willing to pay 8.5 or 8 million for a goalie when you're already paying Erik Karlsson 10 million? You have all those other expensive contracts. So, but Jeremy Swayman is a young player.
Right.
Like you said, he's going to enter the prime of his career in a couple of years. He's definitely this is right now signing this contract is he's right now he's the hottest commodity you could think of as a young goalie in this RFA status and I think recent years. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, and I think wherever he goes, I think Jeremy Swayman is pretty much fantastic. I hope he ends up in a good ecosystem. But if you look at his numbers, expected the goals against, he ranked 5th in the NHL last year. Obviously was their guy come playoffs. So yeah, the Alaskan boy is definitely a big asset on the trade market right now.
Yeah, I think he's gonna end up I think he's gonna end up staying in Boston, but we'll see. What I want to know, guys, in the comments down below is, what do you think is gonna happen with Jeremy Swayman? Do you think he stays in Boston? Do you think he gets traded? And if you think he stays, what do you think he signs at? What do you think the final verdict or contract is going to look like for Jeremy Swayman? I think 8.5 gets it done. I think if Boston offers 8 times 8.5, I think they'll be able to get it done. The question is, are they going to go that far? We'll see. But that's what I believe the asking price would be for Jeremy Swayman in order for him to sign that on the dotted line and be able to play games this season. So, guys, obviously, let us know in the comments down below what are your thoughts on the situation. And, thanks you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe on the video. And we'll see you guys on the next episode of the Young Guns podcast. Thank you very much for watching.